This time, Lily felt sure that a cue was being pressed on her. But it was put forth with such startling suddenness, and with so incredible an air of ignoring what it led up to, that she could only falter out, "Anything upsetting?" "Yes, such as having you so conspicuously on his hands in the small hours. You know, my dear, you're rather a big responsibility in such a scandalous place after midnight." At that, at the complete unexpectedness and the inconceivable audacity of it, Lily could not restrain the tribute of an astonished laugh. "Well, really, considering it was you who burdened him with the responsibility." Mrs. Dorset took this with an exquisite mildness. "By not having the superhuman cleverness to discover you in that frightful rush for the train, or the imagination to believe you'd take it without us, you and he all alone, instead of waiting quietly in the station till we did manage to meet you? No, by our simply all keeping together as niece. Keeping together when it was you who seized the first opportunity to rush off with the Duchess and her friends? My dear Lily, you are not a child to be led by the hand, no, nor to be lectured, Bertha, really, if that's what you are doing to me now." Mrs. Dorset smiled on her reproachfully. "Lecture you? Heaven forbid. I was merely trying to give you a friendly hint. Only, my dear, I didn't understand that one of my duties was not to warn you when you carried your impudence too far." A chill of fear passed over Miss Bart, a sense of remembered treachery that was like the gleam of a knife in the dark. But compassion got the better of her instinctive recoil. What was this outpouring of bitterness but the trapped creature's attempt to cloud the medium through which it was fleeing? It was on Lily's lips to exclaim, "You poor soul, don't double and turn, come straight back to me, and we'll find a way out." But the words died under the impenetrable insolence of Bertha's smile. Lily sat silent, taking the brunt of it quietly, letting it spend itself on her to the last drop of its accumulated falseness. Then, without a word, she rose and went down to her cabin.
Lily encounters Selden, who advises her to leave the yacht. She refuses, but both George and Bertha Dorset are treating her coolly. Lily, the Dorsets, and Selden all meet at a dinner given by the Bryes.
The dinner had been protracted over Mr. Bry's exceptional cigars and a bewildering array of liqueurs, and many of the other tables were empty. But a sufficient number of diners still lingered to give relief to the leave-taking of Mrs. Bry's distinguished guests. This ceremony was drawn out and complicated, and the whole scene had touches of intimacy worth their weight in gold to the watchful pen of Mr. Dad. The Stepneys, who had their motor at the door, offered to convey the Dorsets and Miss Bart to the quay. The offer was accepted, and Mrs. Dorset moved away with her husband. Miss Bart had lingered for a last word with Lord Hubert. Stepney, on whom Miss Bryde was pressing a final cigar, called out, "Come on, Lily, if you're going back to the yacht." Lily turned to go, but Mrs. Dorset, who had paused on her way out, moved back toward the table. "Miss Bart is not going back to the yacht," she said in a voice of singular distinctness. A startled look ran from eye to eye. Mrs. Bryde crimsoned to the verge of congestion. Mrs. Stepney slipped nervously behind her husband, and Selden, in the general turmoil, was mainly conscious of a longing to grip Dabham by the collar and fling him out into the street. Dorset, meanwhile, had stepped back to his wife's side. His face was white. "Bertha, Miss Bart, this is some misunderstanding, some mistake." "Miss Bart remains here," his wife rejoined decisively. "And I think, George, we better not detain Mrs. Stepney any longer." Miss Bart, during this brief exchange, remained in admirable erectness, slightly isolated from the embarrassed group around her. She had paled a little under the shock of the insult, but the discomposure of the surrounding faces was not reflected in her own. The faint disdain of her smile seemed to lift her high above her antagonist's reach. And it was not till she had given Mrs. Dorset the full measure of distance between them that she turned and extended her hand to her hostess. "I'm joining the Duchess tomorrow," she explained, "and it seemed easier for me to remain on shore for the night." She held firmly to Mrs. Bry's wavering eye while she gave this explanation. But when it was over, Selden saw her send a glance from one to another of the women's faces. She read their incredulity in their averted looks and in the mute wretchedness of the men behind them, and he thought she quivered on the brink of failure. Then, turning to him with an easy gesture and the pale bravery of her recovered smile, she said, "Dear Mr. Selden, you promised to see me to my cab." Outside, the fiction of the cab had been tacitly abandoned. They walked in silence, her hand on his arm, till the deeper shade of the gardens received them. He paused beside a bench. "Sit down a moment." She dropped to the seat. The electric lamp shed a gleam on the struggling misery of her face. Selden sat down beside her, waiting for her to speak, fearful lest any word he chose should touch too roughly on her wound. But what had brought her to this pass? Suddenly it struck him that his silence must seem almost as accusatory as that of the other men, whom he despised for turning from her. But before he could find the fitting word, she had cut him short with the question, "Do you know of a quiet hotel? I can send for my maid in the morning." "A hotel? Here? That you can go to alone? It's not possible." She met this with a pale gleam of her old playfulness. "What is that? Sleep in the gardens? But there must be someone. Someone to whom I can go, of course, any number, but at this hour? You see, my change of plans was rather sudden." "Good God, if you'd listened to me!" he cried, venting his helplessness in a burst of anger. She held him off with the gentle mockery of her smile. "But haven't I?" she rejoined. "You advised me to leave the yacht. Now I'm leaving it." He saw then, with a pang of self-reproach, that she meant neither to explain nor to defend herself. That by his miserable silence he had forfeited all chance of helping her, and that the decisive hour was past. "Lily," he exclaimed, with a note of despairing appeal. "Oh, not now," she gently admonished him. "Since I must find shelter somewhere, and since you're so kindly here to help me." He gathered himself up at the challenge. "You will do as I tell you? There's but one thing then. You must go straight to your cousins, the Stepneys." He insisted, "Come, it's late, and you must appear to have gone there directly." He had drawn her hand into his arm, but she held him back. I can't, not that. You don't know when. You mustn't ask me." "I must ask you. You must obey me," he persisted, though infected at heart by her own fear. Her voice sank to a whisper. "And if she refuses? Oh, trust me, trust me." He could only insist in return, and she let him lead her back in silence to the square. They remained silent through the brief drive which carried them to the Stepneys' hotel. Here he left her outside in the darkness of the raised hood while his name was sent up to Stepney. He paced the showy hall, awaiting the ladder's descent. 10 minutes later, the two men passed out between the gold-laced custodians at the threshold. But in the vestibule, Stepney drew up with the last flare of reluctance. "It's understood then," he stipulated with his hand on Selden's arm. "She leaves tomorrow by the early train, and Gwen's asleep and can't be disturbed."